Well, lads, hope we're doing well and welcome to another Q&A episode. First question is, are there any downsides of going over my protein target for the day set at about 2 grams per kilogram of body weight? This is a question that comes up often enough with clients, especially if they're coming from a background of having focused their nutrition around primarily body composition, where the messaging, particularly from bodybuilding communities or bodybuilding advice online, and as a result, the general advice that you'll find online, because a lot of it is based around bodybuilding and body composition improvement, where a lot of the focus tends to be on getting in almost as much protein as possible, which can have merit to a certain degree, but beyond a certain limit, the extra benefits that you're going to gain from that are limited. And this is obviously not the case as much in someone who is using performance enhancing drugs. What we generally tend to see is, and the reason we set protein targets generally around somewhere around 2 grams per kilogram body weight, is because beyond that, any benefits that you are likely to get are minimal. However, even if you're not increasing your protein intake beyond that because you think that it's going to improve your muscle gain or muscle maintenance or some aspect of that, you still may have reasons that you want to increase it. For example, if you just enjoy protein-rich foods more, you may be asking this question from that point of view and wondering, is it okay to go beyond that just from a preference point of view? So with all of those things in mind, the first thing I'll say about increasing your protein intake beyond 2 grams per kilogram of body weight is that there are no major health concerns with doing so. In fact, up to 3 grams plus per kilogram of body weight has been shown to be safe, but there does tend to be some opportunity cost when it comes to increasing your protein intake beyond an amount that's going to bring benefit, especially for athletes who are then going to have to take those extra calories coming from protein away from some other aspect of their nutrition. And generally that's going to come in the form of carbohydrates, where if you are eating 50 grams more protein than you need to be taking, then you're going to have to decrease your carbohydrate intake by 50 grams to remain at the same calorie intake. You could also take that from fat as well. But if your fat is already set relatively low because you're trying to maximize carbohydrate intake, then decreasing your fat substantially could also have other health downsides as well. So generally my recommendation would be to stick with the protein intake at around 2 grams per kilogram of body weight so that you can still maximize the amount of carbohydrates that you're able to consume whilst staying within the calorie targets that you have. Second question is, should I cut calories each day the week leading up to a wedding where I'll be having a big day of eating and drinking? So this is a common approach that can be advised for people who are leading up to a big event where they know they're going to be over consuming, where they use a strategy sometimes called calorie-banking, where they will decrease their calorie intake in the days leading up to an event. So say for an event that is on a Saturday, may decrease their intake of calories by 200 grams per day for the Monday to Friday, which would in theory then give them a 1,000 calorie bank that they could then consume that extra 1,000 calories on the day of the event, and therefore the overall calorie intake for the week will be the same as if they'd had a consistent intake throughout the week. And this approach can work well, but again, with athletes, I find it to be a bit more limiting than it would be with someone who is not an athlete and who's just training for improved body composition or improved strength or other aspects like that. And the reason I say that is because if you're an athlete who is training at a very high level during the week, then decreasing your calorie intake by say 200, 300 calories for every day of that week will mean that that week's training may be slightly less productive. The recovery off the back of the training and the adaptations that you're getting from that training may also be somewhat compromised for that full week. And whilst body composition may be improved or may be maintained by using the calorie banking approach, downside and the trade-off for that potentially could be a week of poorer training, poorer recovery, poorer adaptation from that training. That may be a trade-off that you are willing to take, but I would suggest something different, which is to constrain the calorie decrease that you're trying to implement to the day or the 1 to 2, maybe even 3 days that are around the event, as opposed to it being the full week. So what that might look like in practice is if you had, say, a wedding and you knew that the evening meal, the 3-course evening meal, and the drinks you were going to have afterwards were going to put you well above your usual baseline calorie intake. Rather than decreasing your intake for the full week, what you could do is simply decrease your intake of calories outside of that evening meal and the drinks that you're having. That might mean having a very late breakfast and lunch and giving yourself that buffer of calories for the evening, which again isn't going to take away from that week's training in the same way a calorie banking approach for the full week would, but it's still going to allow you to offset some of the extra calories that you're having that evening. If that was excessive in terms of the extra calories that you were having that evening, you could extend that to even just the day before or even the day after the event as well, giving you again that little bit of buffer, but constraining it to the time around the event as opposed to it affecting your full week of training, recovery, and adaptation. Third question is, what are some more advanced nutrition strategies you use with athletes that they might not even know about before working with you? I will run through some things that I see different about what I do compared just to previous programs that I have either been a part of or seen the back end of or have heard about from the clients that I work with or other people in general. And it would be up to you to decide whether those are more advanced. But some of those things would include things like carbohydrate and calorie periodization, where rather than having one calorie intake for the duration of the week or duration of a time that someone is looking after their nutrition, what I tend to do is perhaps start with that individual calorie and macronutrient set of targets. Over time, especially with athletes, what we're looking to do is have strategies for increasing or potentially even decreasing that calorie and specifically carbohydrate intake based on that day's, that week's training load, in order to give the athlete that ability to provide more energy and more fuel when it's needed most, but do it in a way that is also taking into account that there are other times where they don't need as much fuel and are able to decrease intakes and increase intakes based on those two aspects. Now, we obviously want to do that in a way that also takes into account that week's total intake, so that we're not increasing our calories and decreasing them so much that it's thrown off our average calorie and macronutrient intake for the week, and therefore for the number of weeks that they are in a phase of a specific goal. So for example, if someone is in a fat loss phase and we're constantly increasing their calorie intake on days where they are training and they're training a lot, and we're increasing those calories to such an extent that it's holding them back from fat loss, then we're doing them almost a disservice, or else it may be the case that just their goals need to change. But the way we tend to do it with the carb and calorie periodization is that we set it up in such a way that it allows us to move them towards their body composition goals if they have that, whether that is fat loss, body weight maintenance, or even muscle gain, whilst having those days where we are biasing the calories and the carbs where they are needed most. Another aspect that I don't see talked about as much is the peri-performance nutrition. And what I mean by peri-performance here is the time in and around performance, or it could be peri-training nutrition, peri-workout nutrition, the time in and around training sessions, competition, workouts, etc. And this period of time is something that, again, is probably within the last few percent of what's going to determine your performance outcomes. And I think that's probably why it isn't spoken about as much. But when you're asking here about the advanced nutritional strategies, this is probably something that falls into that category, where we are looking at how can we maximize that period just before, during, and just after our training, our competition, to ensure that we are optimizing our performance, our recovery, and our adaptations from that training session or competition as much as possible. And that might be looking at things like our pre-training or pre-match or pre-race meal, as well as snacks between that, our hydration and our fuel provision during that activity, and even then looking at the period afterwards and assessing are there things that we can do to optimize that time as much as possible. There are also things like the supplementation side of things, where most people will have an idea of the basic supplements that might be beneficial for most people, and those are certainly things that we implement. But when it comes to then people who are at a little bit more of an advanced level with nutrition, we can start to look at other supplements and other supplementation protocols that wouldn't usually be recommended for someone with a basic understanding of nutrition, because they, again, aren't going to be big game changers, but that are going to be the last few percent of difference makers, which is why we preserve them usually for people who I've been working with for a long time, or who come in at an already advanced level of nutrition. I think potentially a fourth one might be to look at what we can do beyond calorie and macronutrient tracking. So for a lot of, and for most of the people that I work with, there will be an element of food tracking that goes into it, and that will involve trying to hit certain calorie and macronutrient breakdown, as well as I talked about previously there, potentially having 2 or 3 different calorie and macronutrient intakes throughout the week based on training, etc. But then there comes a point where most people don't want to be tracking their food forever. And what generally just happens is that they will either go back to their normal way, previous way of eating, or hopefully some of that has carried into what their baseline habits will be, and they'll hopefully be able to then continue to be in the ballpark of where their calorie and macronutrient intakes need to be. But I prefer to be a little bit more strategic with that transition from calorie tracking to not tracking, and getting some behavioral based guidelines in place around that, so that we are able to keep the calorie and macronutrient intakes close to where we want them to be, even without the tracking process. And I'm sure there are other things that would be considered advanced that I may be missing out on simply because I'm used to implementing them, but those are some things that come to mind when I was asked the question. Thanks for listening. If you'd like more free resources or info about my performance nutrition coaching program, hit the link in the podcast description.